Hey everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Rock and Roll Experience with Mike Brunn. On this episode, I'll share with you my unedited conversation with Eddie Trunk as we discuss everything Eric Carr. A couple of weeks ago, I did a podcast on Eric Carr's 70th birthday, and I had asked Eddie to give me a few minutes, maybe just a comment or two, about what Eric Carr meant to him. Eddie was kind enough to spend nearly 45 minutes with me to discuss everything that had to do with Eric Carr, and I wanted to share that conversation with you guys. I think you'll really enjoy hearing the stories about Eric's first show, Eric rehearsing with the Ace Frehley band, what Gene Simmons did for Eddie Trunk the first time Eddie went to see Kiss after Eric Carr's passing, and so much more. I think you guys will really enjoy listening to this conversation. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button below. If you're listening to one of my podcasts, subscribe over there as well. Also, head on over to Facebook and follow my page, The Rock and Roll Experience with Mike Brunn, where each and every day we talk about all the rock and roll music that you love. Now, without further ado, let's get started with my conversation with Eddie Trunk. Awesome. So let's just start with, obviously you were a Kiss fan in the 70s, right? What do you remember the first time you heard that Peter Criss was leaving and Eric Carr was joining, and what your reaction was?
Don't remember the exact time that I heard about Peter leaving. There were rumors that he was not on Unmasked, which I got at the time that it came out. And listening to the record, it was pretty obvious that it wasn't him. And there was a lot of talk around that time, just prior to the release. So, and of course now we know he wasn't on that record. Sure. It was Anton. But I don't really... I remember as a kid really being concerned because it was the first lineup change in the band, and it was pretty catastrophic. I mean, even though at that time, people have a hard time understanding this who aren't my age and didn't live then at that time with Kiss. But Kiss was at rock bottom in their career in America. But they still had their very hardcore fan base that was there, a segment of them like me. So I was like all in and trying to figure out what was really going on. And then I don't remember, obviously it's way before the internet or whatever, so I don't remember exactly how I heard the news that Peter Criss was out, but I did go to Eric Carr's first show. I was at the Palladium, which was his first show.
And what do you remember about that show? What do you remember about it?
What do I remember about it?
Yeah, that must have been crazy.
Well, it was the third time I ever saw Kiss. And probably my third overall ever concert, because my first two concerts were Kiss, 77, 79. So I was a little bit older, and I remember just being astounded that this band was playing a theater. A year earlier, I saw them playing 2 nights at the Garden. A couple years before that, I saw them playing 3 nights at the Garden. And now they're playing a venue that's an old movie theater, maybe holds 3,000 people at most.
Right.
So it was really sort of shocking, and as much as it was going to be cool to see him in a small environment, the other side of me was kind of a little upset because it was just proof that my band really was falling apart at that time.
Sure.
So it was just very mixed emotions, I would say, going into that whole thing.
And what do you remember, if anything, about Eric's performance that night? Does anything stand out to you?
Well, I mean, I remember the buzz out front going in. There was a lot of skepticism. There was, but the fans that went to that show, if you were still going to see Kiss at that time, you were hardcore. So you were going to kind of roll with whatever it was and try to be open-minded and supportive to a new guy coming in. And there was definitely a buzz on the streets. There was a thing about going to shows in New York City back then. It was just a vibe on the street. Everything about it, from people selling the bootleg T-shirts to... all this stuff that went on, the food, the smell of the food carts. I mean, it's all very vivid to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I remember waiting in line out front of the Palladium to get in, and it was a hot ticket. It definitely was a hot ticket because it was obviously a very small place. It turned out being the only American show they played that year for that record. So it was, there was a buzz, even though it was sort of everyone was sort of a little reserved about the fact that wow, how are we seeing them in such a small place?
Right.
But it was still cool to see them in a place like that. And then, everyone sort of was we don't know. Nobody knows about the new guy. And I remember the feeling when everyone first saw the drum kit. If I'm not mistaken, there was sort of a big reveal of the kit. I don't think there was a curtain across the front of the stage, but I think there was a curtain over the kit.
Okay.
And before they played, they pulled the curtain off the kit. And then the first thing that hit everybody was, whoa, double bass.
Sure.
You know,
Right.
There's this giant kit and double bass. So it was a completely like, okay, we're in for a different sort of approach here. And I got to tell you, I mean, I don't know anybody that walked out of that show not being all in on Eric Carr. And that, I mean that with all respect to Peter, who I still love to this day. And Peter is Peter. The original four will never be touched.
Absolutely.
But this was Kiss sort of being supercharged in some way, being a little just the energy he brought. Just an immediately, even though at that point people really didn't hear him talk or didn't know much about him, there was just still a quality about him that was just like, you could tell it was like, wow, how did I get this gig? Like, how am I in this? And it immediately resonated with fans. I mean, I don't think there was I don't recall a person in my group or anyone that I heard on the street that walked out of there in any way not being all in on Eric Carr after that first performance.
Yeah, no, and you're right. I remember it being a hot ticket because I also lived in New York at the time. I was only 10, so I asked my parents to get me a ticket. And of course, it sold out. And I just remember crying my eyes out as a little 10-year-old kid, not understanding, wait, there's this big, I'm thinking huge arena, like you just said, Madison Square Garden, because I saw them in 79. How could there not be a ticket for me? And to this day, I'm like, damn, I never saw Eric in makeup, not once. That's such a huge personal life regret for me.
Yeah, well, speaking of the seeing him play live in makeup bit, actually, interestingly enough, that would have been the only time I did, because I didn't, on the interview I did with you last time, we told my story about Creatures, and I never saw that tour. So the next time I would have seen him with Kiss would have been on the Lick It Up tour. So that actually, I never thought about that, but that actually would have been my only time seeing him in makeup.
Very interesting. Now, what was the first time you met him? Do you remember when that was?
Oh, vividly, yeah. Okay. There's a photo in my first book, I believe, of that meeting. But I didn't make it to the Creatures tour because I had an appendix attack, and you can go back to my interview with Mike archived if you want to hear that whole story again. But I ended up going to Massachusetts on the Lick It Up tour the next year, or whenever that was, 2 years, whatever it was, later, a year. And my mom, I found out, had written a letter, and they got me tickets because I missed the Creatures show, and I went there, and it was the most surreal thing because it was at the Centrum in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I went with some friends, and we got a hotel right next to where the arena was, and we were in the hotel, and we were doing our sort of tailgating in a room, not in out of the car, but in a hotel room. And we were having some beers, and we were getting revved up for the show. And we had a boom box, and we were cranking, Kiss tunes and just getting revved up for the concert. And all we had to do was walk out of the hotel lobby, and the arena was right there. And we had our door open to the hotel just because we figured maybe some other Kiss fans will be walking by going to the show. They'll hear us playing the songs. We wanted to have a party, invite some people in. And as we're there hanging out, we turn and look at the open door, and standing there going, hey, turn down all that noise, I'm trying to get some sleep, was Eric Carr. It's completely like the most crazy, surreal thing ever. And we were like, what? Like, we couldn't believe it. Like, what are the odds that this guy is in the same hotel right next to the arena, and would even, most artists, I'm going to, go by, oh no, there's fans, to knock on the door and come in.
Right.
So we were flabbergasted.
And I think it's important to point out, you were not Eddie Trunk, the radio personality, the TV guy. You were Eddie Trunk, the Kiss fan at a Kiss show.
Super fan.
He had no idea who Eddie Trunk would become. No. This is who Eric Carr was.
This was exactly right. And this would have been 83. Which was the year I started in radio. So I was just starting to become, as you said, Eddie Trunk that people know. But I was at that point, no way, in any way, shape. I mean, I was literally a kid just starting out in radio locally in New Jersey. So he just came in, and we were like, couldn't believe it. And we said, hey, you want a beer? And he said, yeah. He had a beer with us, and we talked for a little bit. And it was me and I think 3 friends. And he goes, "Oh yeah, I got to go to the show. I'll see you guys at the show. Have a good one." And we took a photo. We did. There is a photo. I believe it's in my first book, and of Eric in our hotel room with, I think we had Michelob beers, his hair out to here, and we were just. He walked out. And we're like, we can't believe that actually just happened, and it did. And that was the first time I ever met the guy. Of course, we ended up becoming great friends, but it wasn't then. It would be a few years later.
Right. So, so talk about that. Obviously, as you progressed in your career and in the industry, you got to know Eric more and more. So talk about how you became friends with him and what that friendship was like.
Yeah, well, what happened from there was that I then, for lack of a better explanation, sort of became Eddie Trunk, the known person, because my career started moving pretty quickly, and I started making some noise doing this radio show, and then around '86 I start working for a record label, and at that point I was like 23, about 22, and I start working for a record company, and the first artist I signed is Ace Frehley, and Eric loved Ace.
Yep.
So through Ace, I re-met Eric, and I believe I told him the story about you're not going to, and he's like, really? And I was like, yeah. And at this point, I'm not only a radio guy, but I'm Ace's A&R guy. So we're working more on a, professional level of like, trust and getting to know me a little bit. And, Ace always talked to me about how much he loved Eric. And then when Peter left, how much, he kind of took him under his wing. And so he knew that I was close with Ace at that point already and was working with Ace. And we just, Eric would want to know what was going on with Ace and keep tabs on Ace. And when we were auditioning drummers, he would come down. He'd want to play with Ace. He actually wanted to do a tour with Ace, but Kiss wouldn't let him, doing a club tour. So it was like kind of through Ace. And then, Eric knew that I was then fully in the business. So he was like looking for a sort of confidant and somebody that he felt was going to be able to give him the straight story on what's going on. Someone he could honestly vent to a little bit about some of the challenges he was having in the band or what have you. And I sort of became that guy for him. Sure. And we built a friendship on that. And also the fact that, and this may sound kind of crazy, Mike, but with Kiss, once the lineup changes happened, everyone always, and it's obviously still like that today, Gene and Paul, Gene and Paul, Gene and Paul.
Sure.
And I get that. Obviously, the founding members of the band. But I always, because Eric was such an easygoing guy and such a fun guy, I always wanted to have Eric on.
Sure.
So when we had gotten to know each other well enough that we exchanged phone numbers and everything, I would have him on my radio show all the time. And he would, my radio station, the studio at that time was in Dover, New Jersey. The station was WDHA. Yep. And Eric was just kind of like, really loved the fact that I would let him come on and it would be like, he'd get his moment, like it was one-on-one. He wasn't fighting Gene and Paul for attention. He didn't have to look over his shoulder to wonder if he was saying the right thing. He could just come on and be himself and have fun. Sure. And he really loved that. And he didn't. And because I was local and he was local, it was an outlet for him. Sure. So he would come. He would drive out to the studio, and must have done it 3 or 4 times easily. And he'd sit in and do my show with me. Right. And one time, I'll never forget, one time he did it because I'm half Italian. My mom is Italian. Eric is Italian. And I was living at home maybe the first time he did this. So he drove to my house where I was living, my parents' house. And then we went to the station together. And my mom cooked dinner for him. Oh, wow. And my mom was a great cook and Italian. So it just was like, I remember I think she made some homemade pizza and some other Italian stuff. And he was just like, we just hit it right off. So he was just a great dude, like, to hang with. And remember Gary Corbett, who was Kiss's offstage keyboard player at the time. Gary and Eric were very close. Okay. And Gary came out one time with him. One other time he brought someone else with him, a friend. And we would do the show. We'd always have, anytime he'd come, we'd have a big crowd outside the studio, because the studio is like a house on a highway.
Okay, yeah.
But people would hear the show and hear that he was on, and we'd walk out, and the parking lot would have, any many cars could fit in it. People parked on the lawn and everything, because they'd want a picture or something when we came out. And he'd sit and sign every picture. So we'd do at least another hour on the lawn in front of the station. And then he'd go and I'd go, and that was it. So I have those tapes still. I mean, I've got to dig them out, but they were great times and great memories. And he really, it's hard to understand, like a guy like Kiss would be excited about doing an interview, but to be able to have an outlet to just be him and just him and relax like that was really a big deal. And that's how we connected. And then as I went on in the industry, I helped him out with some things, and he was working on some various projects he needed help with. I connected him with some people. So we not only became good friends, but I helped him wherever I could in his business stuff.
And is that like the Rockhead stuff that he was trying to get promoted at that time?
Yeah, I had a friend at the time that worked at MTV, and Eric had the Rockheads, and he had a couple ideas he was pitching, and he wanted to try to develop that. And I connected him with this guy, and then once I connected them, they went off and did what they did with it, and I didn't follow it really closely. But that was something that I know, he was passionate about trying to make happen.
Absolutely. Now, before you mentioned Eric sometimes being in the studio with Ace, do you remember anything about how obviously we know Ace did Breakout, which was Eric's song, right? Was there ever did Ace and Eric ever jam that together during that time or anything like that?
Very possible, but I didn't witness it myself.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I don't know. I just remember Eric wanting to. There was a tour where Ace needed a drummer, and Eric was, and there was a time where Ace was auditioning, I think, rhythm guitar players, and Eric played the auditions at SIR. Wow. He was the drummer, because Ace's drummer, I think at the time, Anton wasn't around, and the guy he was using wasn't around. So Eric came down and played drums in those auditions for the guitarist. And then I know he really wanted to go out, because I remember Ace saying to me, we might get, Eric might do the tour with me. I'm like, get out of here. He's like, no. And then sure enough, Eric called me. He's like, yeah, that's not going to fly with Gene and Paul. Right.
Now, what do you remember? Obviously, we know that he sang Beth, and we know he wasn't happy about it. Did he ever talk to you about that?
No, I mean, I don't remember him saying anything about that one way or the other. I do know for a long time he absolutely wanted to sing a lead vocal on a record.
Of course, absolutely.
That maybe not certainly not necessarily a Kiss classic done by him, but he wanted to sing his own song and have a song on a record. And to that end, for him, Little Caesar was a huge moment. Right. He was intensely proud that he got a chance to do that. Yeah. So I know that was super important to him, and he played bass on it as well, and he wrote it, and he was really, really excited to have that on Hot in the Shade. But I don't remember him saying anything to me about how his whole thing about Beth. I mean, he was very objective about stuff. Like he knew I was a fan, but he wouldn't call me and say to me, oh, the record we just made is the greatest thing we ever made. He'd tell me, I don't know if this is going to fly with the fans. And they want me doing this. I don't really want to do this. And he was really he would have those kind of conversations with me.
Right, absolutely. Now, to me, it's a travesty that when I listen to something like Rockology and his songs that are on there, songs like Eyes of Love, Somebody's Waiting, they should have been on Kiss albums to me. And his songs would have made the Kiss albums to me that much better in the 80s than they were, because some of them are a little hit and miss. They could have used some Eric Carr on them to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just a case of really trying to spoon feed them to the fans a little bit. And look, I mean, any band, when there's a lineup change, whenever the first moment happens where it's no longer the original four, there's always a shift in control. There's always a balance, a power balance that just slides. And that is what happened with Eric with Kiss. I mean, then Gene and Paul assumed complete control of the band, as they've had ever since. Yep. And make of that what you will. I mean, but they put the work in. It's their band. We get it. But I think at that point, it was just sort of like, they were bringing them along slowly, and having material that you wrote on an album. If you put something on, that means something that you wrote comes off, meaning Gene or Paul. And anybody who knows anything about the music industry knows that the business is a big part of the business is publishing, meaning
Absolutely.
who wrote the songs.
Mm-hmm.
So if you give up a spot on a record to your new guy who's the drummer, that's just a song that is coming off in most cases that you wrote,
Right.
and you don't want to take writing credits off of your own record because that's, that stuff pays forever if you manage it right.
Right. Absolutely.
So, it was just a control and an ego thing, and also probably just sort of like bringing them along slowly. And I think also most people just look at drummers as guys that aren't writers and aren't necessarily great overall musicians. They're great. Some are, of course, but they're mostly there to play drums, and they don't write songs.
Sure.
And Eric was an exception to that. We really didn't know that until I think much later.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you have a favorite memory of being with Eric Carr at all?
Certainly, like outside of the radio stations, like doing the interviews was fun, and he was just such a ball buster and goof around so much. So when we were done with the interviews and we'd hang out in the parking lot, those were always a lot of fun because that was like a party after the interview with the fans. That hit me introducing Kiss on the Hot in the Shade tour at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, and him walking me to the stage and feeding me shots of Chivas Regal and telling me not to be nervous and just making me more nervous.
Of course.
And then throwing drumsticks at my back through the curtain while I was on the mic in front of 15,000 people in my home state introducing my favorite band. So he would just, just a lot of ball busting stuff. Those are the things that come to mind really quickly, right to the top of my head. And I've said this a lot of times, all those years I was doing that metal show, I thought of Eric every episode because he would have loved that show because he was such a ball buster. He loved to mix it up. He loved to goof around. And he would have gotten into the spirit of that so much. He would have been on multiple times, and we would have loved to have had him. And I that's the one thing all the time when I shot that show, I'm like, oh man, Eric would be eating this up if he was here right now.
Absolutely.
So unfortunately, he didn't live to see that, but that was definitely something I think about all the time.
Absolutely. Now, you were at his first show. Were you at his last show at Madison Square Garden on the Hot in the Shade tour?
Sure, I would have had to be. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, they played the Garden on Hot in the Shade?
Yeah, it was the final night of the tour. They played the Garden. It was like November of 19...
They played the Meadowlands too, though, right?
They played the Meadowlands and the Nassau Coliseum in June, the end of June, and then they played the Garden the beginning of November. I think it's like November 7th or 9th-ish, like in that time period.
Right. So absolutely, I would have been for sure.
Okay, yeah. So obviously at the time, we didn't know that would be his final show, right?
No, and I mean, I did know, though, that he was having a lot of problems with Paul on that tour. He told me that on more than one occasion, that entire tour, I don't even think they talked, from what I understand. So there was a lot of headbutting going on at that time. And he wasn't happy about the drum sound on that record. I remember we hung out in L.A., because, see, that was the other thing. He was a big fan of some of the bands on Megaforce that I was working with, like King's X and Anthrax and those bands.
Yep.
So we would hang out in L.A., and he would I remember when they made Hot in the Shade, I remember him saying to me, he goes, yeah, we're doing it in like a demo studio. It's really done, it's not, the sounds aren't right. And I think he told me they were using some electronic drums and all this stuff. And he's just like, yeah. And, I knew that there were some cracks starting to show between him and the band. The honest truth of it, Mike, is I don't know if he hadn't died. I don't know if he would have stayed in the band. Right. Well, from one way or the other, either him leaving or them letting him go, because there was definitely issues towards the end unrelated to him getting sick.
And Bruce has alluded to that and even spoken about it a little bit as well. And Bruce has kind of said, like, Eric just had this, like, drummer's complex, he calls it, or Ringo complex, where Eric was just never satisfied and always wanted more. And like you said, it was Paul and Gene's band, and they just weren't willing to give him more of a role than being the drummer of Kiss. And he just never seemed happy with that, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that he was also a little bit of a worrier, and maybe I don't think he, I think he always was looking for more and wanting to do more and have a bigger voice and be more involved as the time went on. Didn't want to just be sort of like looked at as the hired gun guy. I think he knew how much the fans really loved him, and the fans would wind him up on that too. Of course, hey man, you got to sing more. You got to, how come, because again, the guy he replaced, Peter, sang a ton of songs and was so I think people were looking at him as being more of a full more of a full role, and he was hoping it would go to that too. But that just speaks to how the world shifts when a lineup change happens.
Of
because
course.
any band, the original lineup, all for one for all, everybody equal, blah, blah, blah. Take one piece out, and there's just going to be a power shift towards one side.
Absolutely.
And anyone's coming into a situation like that is going to have to come in under those sort of conditions. So although I'm sure there was he was very grateful that he was the drummer in Kiss, at the same token, he was hoping that as a musician, he could go on to become like fully more realized as what he wanted to contribute.
Do you remember where you were and how you found out when he passed away?
Yes, I do. I spoke to him. It was right around Thanksgiving. He died when? November
27th, I think it was, of 91.
Right after probably.
Right around, right after Thanksgiving. Yep.
Right around. So I spoke to him throughout his whole medical issues. And this speaks to me, what I said about him. Probably, not long for the band one way or the other, because he would call me and ask me about bands looking for drummers. I'll never forget one time he called me and said, I heard Whitesnake is looking for a drummer. Can you kick the tires for me and find out? And I used to get so mad at him because at the time he was fighting his medical problems. And I would just be like, dude, just get healthy. There's no way you're not going to be in Kiss. The fans would revolt. There's no way. And just worry about your health and everything will take care of itself. Just tell me if you hear anything about Whitesnake. And he knew, in his mind, and of course it turned out to be true, that Eric Singer was going to take his gig. He knew that Eric Singer was around. He knew that Paul had played with him. He saw the writing on the wall. He really did. And so that's why he was looking as like, I'm going to get better, but I want to find another gig when I do. And I would always argue with him about that because I'd be like, just get better, and there's no way you're going to lose out on Kiss. It just can't happen. And then he did an interview with me after he had open heart because he had a big scar. And we talked about the surgery. I really have to find these tapes. But
I probably have them somewhere also, recorded off the radio.
Yeah, I mean, they're out there. And he had a big scar, and we talked about it. I remember it was the last interview we did with him, or I did with him on that when he came to my show. And he talked about what he went through. He was on the road to recovery. He was goofing about his scar. He's like, man, I'm going to look tough now when I play. And then that ended, and I think Gary Corbett was with him at that interview. And that would have been like, I don't know, say maybe October or something, late October. And he went back in the hospital, I believe, if I'm remembering that. I could be wrong on the timeline, but he went back in the hospital. He told, because he had some complications and they found a growth, or they found more stuff that they had to deal with. And I said to him, again, you got to remember, this was before the days of email and texting and cell phones even. So to talk, you had to connect on landlines and make sure you were home and whatever. So we weren't as in touch as much as we wanted to, because if he was in the hospital, I would have to find somebody to get the number in his room. And so I remember him telling me that he was going back in for some stuff. And then it was just before Thanksgiving, I believe. And he called me up and he said to me, guess what? I got great news. I said, what? He said, I just came out of all the work, the hospital, the workups, all the tests, everything that happened. He goes, and I'm good. I said, you're good? He said, yeah. He said, I'm great. He goes, I'm good. Clean bill of health. I'm going to be okay. I'm like, oh my God, thank goodness. This is the best news could have for the holidays. I go, dude, call your, because I think at that time he told me he didn't call anybody yet. He didn't call his parents or nobody. And I said, Eric, call your family. This is the best news. Call me back after Thanksgiving. We'll hang, whatever. He was like, yeah, thanks, man, thanks. I just want to let you know I'm good. Tell the fans I'm good. It's like, okay. And a few days later, I got a call from Gary Corbett. And I remember Gary being really upset, and I answered the phone, and I said, what's up, Gary? And I remember Gary saying something to the fact of, like, we lost them. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he goes, Eric died the other day. I go, what? I said, he just called me days ago. He said he was recovering. He said they got everything. And he said something happened, whether it was a seizure or I don't know what the final thing that took him was, but a heart attack, an emblem, an aneurysm, whatever it was, as part of all his procedures, just burst or whatever ended up happening. I mean, others in his family would know the details of that more. But it was just, it struck me as really shocking, given the fact that he had just told me he was better and going to get better and was very optimistic about his future. And again, he said to me, keep your eyes open for gigs, man. And I'm like, would you stop?
Right. And this is literally like the week of his passing, it sounds like, that you had spoken to him.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
It was like very, very few days later that it seemed like he was gone. At least that's the timeline I remember.
Right, of course. And, as you're sharing this story with me, my body went cold, just as if it was the first time I heard it on the radio. Because if you remember the radio station Z-Rock, that's where I heard it on. I grew up in Brooklyn. That's where I was. I was listening, and they said Eric Carr passed away, and I literally pulled over my car, and I was like, what? Yeah. I thought I read in a magazine that he was starting to recover and do better, and it was just like, it stunned the KISS community. And I could only imagine somebody like yourself, who was more friendly with him, talked to him just a few days later, the total shock he must have had. Unbelievable.
Yeah, I was devastated. I mean, he was of course I was a huge fan, but he was my friend. And he was, I was sort of a confidant for him. So it was just devastating. And I was floored. I mean, I was still living at home at the time. And my mom knew him and loved him, and my dad, and we were just all devastated. We really were. And I remember he did the video for God Gave Rock and Roll to You, even though he's not on the song. That was really important to him. He wanted fans to see that he was still strong and could do it. He didn't want to be perceived as being hurt and injured and sick and not being able to pull his weight. So it was important to him that even though he didn't play on the song, that he appeared in that video. That was like him holding on to his last rung with KISS to hold his position. But he just, because he felt that no matter what, he was going to be out of the band and replaced by Eric Singer, no matter what happened.
Sure. So do you think that, on Revenge, he ultimately passes away, they do Carr Jam, right? And they put like in the liner notes a little mention of him. Do you think KISS did enough, or do you think they should have done more? I always felt they should have had something in the booklet, like pictures of him. Because I was a huge Eric Carr fan in the 80s, and I thought Carr Jam was cool. But I felt as a KISS fan, I wanted more from KISS during that time, more acknowledgement. This is the drummer I grew up with for 10 years loving, and a little sentence, in my opinion, wasn't enough for me as a fan.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I can certainly see your point. I mean, I was again, you have to remember at that time, and I don't know all the particulars of this, others maybe would, but there was a lot of weirdness between him and his family and the KISS camp.
Absolutely.
I mean, to the point that I had heard a story, they were not welcome to the wake or the funeral. There was stories about what happened to his health coverage. There was a lot of really distasteful, hard to believe allegations thrown around at that time at the end of his life. And, I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle of all of it, somewhere at the halfway point on each side. But it was not, he didn't talk to Paul on the last tour. And it was there was a lot of sort of almost, unfortunately, my recollection is sort of a battle line drawn, like, okay, here's the people that really cared about Eric and were good to him. And here's the people that weren't as he was sick. And those guys were on the other side of that ledger at that time. Whether that's calmed over the decades, I don't know, but it was definitely a weird vibe. I definitely remember that. So I was kind of surprised knowing that they did what they did in Revenge.
Okay.
I really was.
That makes sense.
And to put Carr Jam on there and to make the acknowledgement, I thought was actually maybe more than I ever even expected that they would do. But he would like, I do remember that because he was a guy that like was so good to me. Like every tour, definitely Hot in the Shade, I think Crazy Nights, I have to look, they would have these booklets that would show you each day, a day book.
Okay. Yep.
So when a tour is 90 shows or whatever, again, this is all before cell phones and
Sure.
texting and so if you wanted a family member or a friend to know where you were on any given day, you'd give them one of these books, and each day in the book it would say load in, sound check, hotel, stay over, drive to, and the hotel phone number. And that he would send me one of those at the start of the tours. He'd always send them to me with 2 laminates, 2 all-access laminates. He'd be like, here's where I'm going to be for the next 3 months. Come out and hang whenever you want. So all I needed was that book to know where they were, and I could walk right in with my pass.
Right.
So I did that a few different times, and we just and he was my guy. Like on those tours, he was the guy I would hang with. I'd be in his dressing room. I'd hang with him. He was a real guy to me.
Right.
And I do remember that when the Revenge tour started, there was a lot of mixed feelings and emotions about that for the people who were close with Eric, because of the way things were handled. I think there was some weirdness at the time with Eric Singer, some comments that people didn't like or something that were said. And I remember I'll never forget this. I went to I believe one of the first shows, if not the first show of Revenge, was at Bethlehem, PA.
Yep.
At Stabler Arena.
Yep.
Which from where I live was not that far of a drive, and I went to a few shows back then. And I remember driving out to that show and getting there a couple hours before this show started and going backstage, and I was in the catering room talking to some people, and Gene walked over to me, and he made a point to introduce me to Eric Singer, to sort of like, because again, I think there was some weirdness flying around then even. And then he said to me, come on, I want to show you the new stage. And the doors didn't open yet. And he had me walk the stage with him.
Okay, nice.
And he showed me the Statue of Liberty and all this stuff. And I never really it was the only time Gene was ever like that towards me. And I think that a lot of it had to do, and I think he even made a comment that he knew that I was hurting, that Eric wasn't there. Eric Carr. He knew Eric was my guy. He knew Eric I was in touch with. Eric got me into all the shows, whatever. And he kind of knew that it was going to be weird for me and emotional the first show, him not being there.
Sure.
So to me, I always took that as it being Gene's way, because Gene's not the kind of warm and fuzzy guy that was going to give you a hug or whatever.
Right.
But it was his sort of way of saying, let me show you what we're doing now. And
trying to comfort you in a way. Right. Trying to comfort you. Right.
Yeah. I'll never forget that. It was the only time anything like that ever happened like that with Gene and I.
That's a great story, actually. I love that. Do you have any favorite songs that Eric Carr played on? Like when you listen to it, you say, man, I love his drumming on that song. Anything that comes to mind?
Creatures top to bottom.
Of course.
Creatures is one of my greatest drum albums, air drum albums, drum sound albums, drum performance. I mean, Creatures is just, to this day, unbelievable. And it's funny because I remember, them doing The Elder, and I always used to talk to Eric about this, being like, man, here you are coming into this heavy rock band, and that's your first record. You must have been like, what the hell? And then the swing back, though, with Creatures was pretty kick-ass, though. So Creatures is amazing. I got to say, I mean, Creatures is the standout because the record's so strong and the drum sound's so strong and the performance is so strong. But really, everything. I mean, I love Asylum. I even love Crazy Nights. Most people don't, but I do.
No, I do. I like that.
I mean, it's a commercial pop record, but I like it. I like a lot of stuff on Lick It Up, of course. Animalize. I mean, I'll never forget hearing I've Had Enough and the double kick and like, whoa, what's going on here? Open to King of the Mountain. I saw them do that, I think, in New Haven, Connecticut. It was the only time I ever saw them do it live. So all of that stuff, later on, Hot in the Shade, again, it's a thin-sounding record. Sonically, it's, and I think Eric said they used some electronic drums on that. And then like the studio tracks on Smashes, Thrashes, X and Sex, again, I think those are even drum machines.
Right.
So that's,
sound like it.
Yeah, that lost me a little bit, but any of the classic stuff, but Creatures is the standout. I mean, Creatures is one of my favorite records ever, from not only from Kiss, but just from a drum standpoint.
Right. No, absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Is there anything else that you wanted to share that you remember about Eric that maybe the fans would love to hear about?
Just an amazing sense of humor, a fun guy. People just immediately took to him, just a lovable guy. And that's the thing. I mean, any fan watching or listening to this can know what he was as a musician, because you can hear the records. Maybe you were lucky enough to see the shows. Real strong singer, better songwriter than he was given credit for, played bass on some songs.
Yeah.
So really an all-around musician, which people didn't really realize. But being lucky enough to have called him a friend and known him and really loved the guy, just a great person, just such a good, fun, loving, music-loving person. And that's what I miss the most about him. I would go to LA, we'd hang out, we'd go to shows. You know, he'd come sit there and do my radio show with me, and we'd just laugh and have fun, and just being able to see him be able to let his guard down and exhale and just be himself was so great. Didn't take it all too seriously. And, you know, just really the quality and caliber of person he was more than anything. Absolutely. Is something that I think fans really need to know about. And I've said this all the while, and I say this with no disrespect to any of the other replacement members that were in Kiss after him, but I think everyone can universally agree, the most loved non-original member of the band. The first non-original member, but just the most loved, maybe because he was the first, but I also think it had a lot to do with just this sort of different level connection he had with fans. I think fans saw something of themselves in him, like, wow, this guy was repairing gas ranges and now he's on this stage. And he was always willing and open to talk about where he came from, and he never forgot where he came from. Yeah. And I think that resonated a lot too. It's not like he got into the band and became too big time for everybody. Agreed. And acted above everyone. And that really was a big quality I think a lot of people connected with.
Yeah, and that's why I said for me, he was my musical idol all through the 80s, because to me, he was one of us. Right? He was the drummer in Kiss, but he seemed like just a regular guy. Unfortunately, I never met him, but any interview, he just came across as like just down to earth, regular guy who just so happened to be the right place at the right time and became the drummer of Kiss. And I always connected with that as a fan, always.
Yeah, it resonated with a lot of people, made a great connection with a lot of people. And, you know, I was contacted recently by his sister about a potential documentary that they're going to work on him.
Yep.
And she said that there was a crew, and she asked me if I'd speak about him and our friendship, and I said, of course. But obviously, because of the virus, you know, not a good time to be having crews and stuff in your house.
Absolutely.
So I told her as soon as that all clears and we can get back to normal, I'd give her whatever time she wants to. You know, I told her anything for Eric. So I'm glad, and I hope that comes off. I hope that happens, because his story is deserving to be told in a big, professional manner. I really hope it works out.
Me too. Well, thanks. I appreciate you taking time to chat about this and do this with me. Alrighty, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Eddie Trunk as we discussed everything Eric Carr. I want to take a moment and really thank Eddie for the conversation. I had asked Eddie if he would give me 5 minutes, maybe just a brief statement about Eric Carr's 70th birthday, and he was kind enough to stay with me and chat for 45 minutes. So thanks a lot, Eddie. I really appreciated it, and I know the fans will really enjoy hearing all of your stories. While you're here, if you're watching on my YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button below. If you're listening to one of my podcasts, subscribe over there as well. Head on over to Facebook and follow my page, The Rock and Roll Experience with Mike Brunn, where each and every day we talk about all the rock and roll music that you love. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching. See you next time.